They called me useless, stole everything, and kicked me out. But years later, they came back, begging to work under me.
My father died felt like the sky had collapsed over my life, and everything that once gave me warmth suddenly turned cold and distant, as if I had been quietly pushed out of my own story. Without warning, I remember standing in the corner of our living room watching people come and go, their faces wrapped in fake sorrow, their voices filled with whispers that carried more curiosity than grief, and in the middle of all that noise I felt, completely invisible, my elder brother Samir stood tall near the entrance, greeting everyone with a confidence that felt almost rehearsed, like he had already stepped into a role he had been preparing for long before this moment. My mother stayed close to him, her eyes red but her posture firm, as if she had already decided where her loyalty would stand, and it was not with me. No one came to ask how I was feeling, no one placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, no one even met my eyes for more than a second, because in this family I had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed in the background, the one who was never expected to become anything important. I had grown used to that role over the years, but that day, it felt heavier than ever, as if silence had turned into a prison I could not escape. After the burial, when the house slowly emptied and the last of the guests left behind a trail of empty cups and fading sympathy, the walls seemed to close, and around me every corner of the house held a memory of my father, his laughter, his voice, his presence, and yet none of it felt like it belonged to me anymore. It was as if the connection I had with him had been quietly erased along with his absence. A week later, we gathered again in the same living room, but this time there were fewer people and the air carried a different kind of tension, the kind that sits quietly before something irreversible happens. The lawyer arrived with a briefcase and a neutral expression. He greeted everyone politely and then took his seat while I sat on the far end of the sofa, my hands resting on my knees, trying to steady the storm inside my chest. I had no expectations of wealth or luxury. I only hoped for acknowledgement, for a sign that my father had seen me, even if others had not. The lawyer began reading the will, his voice calm and steady, each word landing like a soft echo in the room. At first everything sounded formal and distant, references to properties, assets, accounts, and responsibilities, but then came the moment that changed everything. He paused for a second and then said that all assets were to be transferred to my mother Shabana and my elder brother Samir, and just like that it was over. No mention of my name, no small share, no personal belonging, nothing. I felt my heartbeat drop, as if time had stopped around me. I blinked once, twice, waiting for him to correct himself, but he did not. I leaned forward slightly, my voice barely holding together as I said, there must be some mistake, because I could not accept that I had been erased so completely. Samir let out a quiet laugh, not loud but sharp enough to cut through my confusion. He leaned back in his seat with a smirk on his face and said there was no mistake in that. Our father trusted him more than anyone else. His words were not just an explanation, they were a declaration, a reminder of how he saw himself and how he saw me. I turned to my mother, hoping for some form of comfort or denial, but she avoided my eyes for a moment before finally speaking, her voice calm but cold. She said that I had never contributed anything meaningful to the family, and that it made sense for everything to go to someone who had actually done something with his life. Her words hit me harder than the will, because they confirmed what I had always feared, that in her eyes I was not just overlooked but undeserving. I felt a burning sensation in my chest, not from anger alone but from a deep aching disappointment that I could not put into words. I wanted to argue. I wanted to remind them of the countless nights I had spent trying to find my path, the silent efforts I had made, the struggles I had faced without ever asking for help, but the words refused to come out. It was as if my voice had been stolen along with my place in the family. The meeting ended quickly after that, as if there was nothing left to discuss. The lawyer packed his papers, my brother stood up with satisfaction, and my mother walked away without another glance in my direction, leaving me sitting there alone, surrounded by silence that felt louder than any argument. That night I walked through the house, slowly touching the walls, the furniture, the small details that had once felt like home but now felt like they belonged to someone else. I entered my room and looked around at the few things I owned, my books, my clothes, my memories, and I realized how little I actually had in physical terms, but how much I had lost emotionally. I packed a small bag with the essentials, not because I wanted to leave, but because I understood that there was no place for me there anymore. No invitation, no belonging, just an unspoken message that I was no longer part of that world. As I stepped out of the house for the last time, I paused at the door, hoping for someone to call me back, for someone to say that this was all a misunderstanding, but no voice came. The door closed behind me with a quiet finality, and I found myself standing on the street under a dim light, holding a bag and carrying a heart heavier than anything I had ever known. I walked without direction for a while, letting my thoughts drift between disbelief and pain, questioning everything about myself, wondering if they were right, if I truly was nothing, if all The effort I had put into trying to build something of my own had been invisible not just to them but to the world itself, but beneath that doubt there was a small spark, a quiet voice that refused to be silenced. It reminded me of the nights I had spent learning, growing, failing and trying again. It reminded me that while they had never seen my journey, it did not mean it did not exist, and as I kept walking that spark began to grow stronger, pushing against the weight of rejection and loss. Turning my pain into something else, something sharper, something more determined. I realized that what had happened was not just an ending but also a beginning, a harsh one filled with uncertainty, but still a beginning nonetheless. They believed they had taken everything from me. They believed I was left with nothing, but what they did not know, what they could never see, was that my real story had already begun long before that day, and the wealth I was building was not something they could measure or understand. As the night grew deeper and the streets grew quieter, I made a silent promise to myself that I would not let this moment define me, that I would not remain the person they believed me to be, and that one day I would return, not for revenge born out of anger, but for something far more powerful, the quiet satisfaction of proving them wrong without saying a single word. Because sometimes the strongest response is not spoken, it is lived. And that night, as I disappeared into the darkness carrying nothing but my determination, I knew that this was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning of something they would never expect. After leaving the house that night with nothing but a small bag and a heart full of pain, I stepped into a life that no one in my family would ever understand, because for them I had always been the quiet one, the one who never spoke much about his struggles and never showed what he was truly capable of. And even though they believed I had nothing, the truth was far more complicated, because long before my father passed away, I had already started building something in silence, something small at first but powerful enough to change my future in ways they could never imagine. I remember the early days when I first realized that I could not depend on anyone, not even my own family, and that realization pushed me toward learning skills that no one around me valued. I spent countless nights sitting in front of an old laptop with slow internet, trying to understand things that felt impossible at the time. I would watch tutorials, read articles, and practice over and over again until my eyes burned and my body felt exhausted. But I never stopped, because deep inside I knew that this was my only way out. While Samir was busy working with my father in the family business, gaining recognition and praise, I was quietly exploring the digital world, learning how to write, how to design, how to communicate with people from different parts of the world, and how to turn small opportunities into something meaningful. At first, nothing worked the way I wanted it to. I faced rejection after rejection. Clients ignored me, messages went unanswered, and sometimes I would spend days working on something only to be told that it was not good enough. Those moments were painful because they made me question my abilities and my worth, but instead of giving up, I used that pain as fuel. I told myself that every failure was a step closer to success, and that one day all these struggles would make sense. After I left home, I rented a tiny room in a crowded area where the walls were cracked and the ceiling fan made a constant noise that made it hard to sleep. The room was barely enough for a bed and a small table, but it was mine, and for the first time in my life I felt a strange sense of freedom. Even though I had no comfort, no security, and no support, I had control over my own life, and that was something I had never experienced before. The first few months were extremely difficult. There were days when I did not have enough money to eat properly, and nights when I lay awake, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake by leaving everything behind. But every time doubt tried to take over, I reminded myself of the way my family had treated me, and that memory pushed me to keep going. I started taking small freelance jobs online, writing short articles, designing simple graphics, managing social media accounts for small businesses, anything that could bring in even a little income. The payments were small and sometimes delayed, but each completed project gave me a sense of progress, and slowly I began to build confidence in my abilities. I learned how to communicate professionally, how to meet deadlines, and how to deliver quality work even under pressure. As time passed, I started getting better clients, people who valued my work and were willing to pay more for it, and with each new opportunity one pushed myself harder. I would wake up early, work throughout the day, and continue late into the night, constantly improving my skills and expanding my knowledge. I stopped thinking of myself as a victim and started seeing myself as someone who was in control of his own destiny. One day I received a message from a client based in another country offering me a project that was bigger than anything I had ever handled before. It required more effort, more time, and more responsibility than I was used to, and for a moment I felt afraid. I questioned whether I was ready for such a challenge, but then I remembered all the struggles I had already faced, and I decided to take the risk. I dedicated myself completely to that project, working tirelessly to ensure that every detail was perfect. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed, when things did not go as planned, and when I thought I might fail, but I refused to give up. I pushed through every obstacle and gave It everything I had. When the project was finally completed, the client was extremely satisfied, and not only did I receive a payment that was larger than anything I had earned before, but I also gained something far more valuable: trust and recognition. That success changed everything for me. It opened doors to new opportunities and introduced me to people who saw my potential and believed in my work. I started receiving more offers, more projects, and better payments, and for the first time I felt like my efforts were truly paying off. Within a year, I was earning enough to move into a better place, a small apartment that felt like a huge upgrade compared to where I had started. I bought new equipment, improved my working environment, and continued to invest in myself because I understood that growth never stops. As my income increased, I began to explore other ways to build wealth. I learned about investing, about creating multiple streams of income, and about managing finances wisely. I did not want to depend on a single source of income because I knew how quickly things could change, so I diversified my work. I started my own online projects, collaborated with others, and gradually built a system that allowed me to earn even when I was not actively working. Every step of the way, I remained silent about my progress. I did not share my success with my family or anyone from my past because I wanted my achievements to speak for themselves. When the time was right, I remembered every word they had said to me, every moment they had made me feel worthless, and I used those memories as motivation, not for revenge driven by anger, but for a deeper purpose, to prove to myself that I was capable of more than they had ever believed. As the years passed, I transformed, not just financially but mentally and emotionally. I became more confident, more disciplined, and more focused on my goals. I no longer sought validation from others because I had learned to believe in myself, and that belief became my greatest strength. By the end of 3 years, I had built a life that was completely different from the one I had left behind. I had financial stability, independence, and a sense of purpose that I had never experienced before. I was no longer the quiet, overlooked person my family remembered. I was someone who had faced rejection, failure, and loneliness and turned it into success through hard work and determination. And yet, despite everything I had achieved, I never forgot where I came from or what I had gone through, because those experiences shaped me into the person I had become. And even though my family had never supported me and had even pushed me away, I did not feel hatred toward them. I felt something more complex, a mixture of sadness, understanding, and quiet strength. I knew that one day our paths would cross again, and when that moment came, I would not need to say anything to prove my worth, because my life would already be the answer they never expected. And so I continued to move forward, building, growing, and preparing for a future that was entirely my own, knowing that the greatest success is not just in what you achieve, but in who you become along the way. And in that journey, I found something far more valuable than wealth. I found myself. Years had passed since I walked away from my family, and in that time my life had transformed in ways I once thought were impossible. Yet despite all the success I had built, there were still moments when memories of the past would return quietly, reminding me of where everything began. And one evening, as I sat in my apartment reviewing work and planning my next move, my phone rang from an unknown number, and at first I ignored it, thinking it was just another random call, but something inside me pushed me to answer, and the moment I heard the voice on the other end, I felt a strange shift inside me, because it was my cousin, someone I had not spoken to in years. His voice sounded different, weaker, and filled with hesitation, as if he did not know how to say what he needed to say. He asked me how I was, and for a brief moment we exchanged a few formal words before he paused and then told me that I should come back home because things were not good. And there was something in his tone that made it clear this was not a casual suggestion, but something serious, something urgent. I did not respond immediately because the word home no longer felt simple to me. It carried memories of pain, rejection, and silence, but curiosity slowly took over, and after ending the call I sat there for a long time thinking about whether I should go back or not. Part of me wanted to ignore it and continue living the life I had built, while another part of me wanted to see what had changed, what had happened to the people who once believed I was nothing. Eventually I decided to go, not because I felt any obligation, but because I wanted closure. I wanted to face the past, not as the person who had left broken, but as the person I had become, strong and independent. The next day I drove toward the house I once called home, and as I got closer, everything started to feel familiar yet strangely distant, like revisiting a place from a different life. When I finally stood in front of the house, I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. The paint was faded, the gate looked worn, and the overall appearance lacked the care it once had. And as I stepped inside, the difference became even more obvious. The house felt quiet, not peaceful, but empty, like something important had been lost. The walls that once held pride now carried signs of neglect, and the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tension. I walked slowly through the hallway, noticing how everything had changed until I reached the living room where I saw my mother and Samir sitting together, but they did not look the same. My mother, who once carried herself with confidence, now seemed tired, her face showing signs of stress and worry. And Samir, who once stood tall with pride, now looked defeated. His posture slouched, his eyes avoiding mine as if he could not face me directly. For a moment no one spoke, and the silence between us felt louder than any words. Finally I broke it by asking what happened. And my voice remained calm, not out of indifference, but because I had learned to control my emotions over the years. Samir shifted slightly but said nothing, and it was my mother who spoke, her voice softer than I had ever heard before, as she explained that the business had failed. And as she spoke I listened carefully, not interrupting, not reacting, just observing, because this was the same business that had been taken from me, the same business that I was told I was not worthy of being part of. She explained how Samir had made decisions that did not go as planned, how he had taken loans and trusted people who turned out to be unreliable, how one mistake led to another until everything started falling apart, and as the losses increased the pressure grew heavier, and eventually they reached a point where they could not recover on their own. I looked at Samir, waiting for him to say something, but he remained silent, his pride clearly struggling with the reality he was facing, and in that moment I realized something important. The roles had changed. The person who once looked down on me now could not even meet my eyes, and the person who once dismissed me now stood in front of me asking for understanding. My mother then said something that I never expected to hear. She said that they needed help, and those words carried a weight that went beyond their simple meaning because they represented a complete shift in how they saw me. I stood there absorbing everything, feeling a mix of emotions that were difficult to describe. There was a part of me that remembered every hurtful word, every moment of rejection, every time I was made to feel like I did not belong, and that part of me wanted to walk away, to leave them in the same way they had left me. But there was another part of me that had grown through struggle, that had learned the value of resilience and perspective, and that part of me saw the situation differently. I realized that this was not just about revenge or justice, this was about who I had become as a person. I walked around the room slowly, taking in the details, the faded furniture, the quiet corners, the absence of life that once filled this place, and I thought about how different things could have been if they had treated me differently, if they had supported me instead of pushing me away. But thinking about the past would not change the present, and I knew that whatever decision I made in that moment would define not just my relationship with them, but also my own character. I stopped in front of them and looked at both of them carefully, seeing not the authority they once had, but the vulnerability they now carried, and in that moment I understood that life has a way of shifting power in ways no one expects. The same people who once stood above you can find themselves below you, and the same person who was once overlooked can rise in ways that cannot be ignored. And as I stood there I felt a sense of calm clarity, replacing the confusion that had followed me for years, because I finally saw the full picture. I saw where I had been and where I was now, and I realized that my success was not just measured by what I had achieved, but by how I chose to respond in moments like this. My mother looked at me again, waiting for an answer, and Samir finally lifted his eyes slightly, not fully meeting mine, but enough to show that he was listening, and in that silence I knew that whatever I said next would change everything, not just for them, but for me as well, because this was the moment where the past and present collided, and the future would be shaped by a single decision. And as I took a deep breath, I felt the weight of that choice settle inside me, knowing that this was more than just a return to a place I once left behind. This was the turning point, where my story would move from survival to something far more meaningful, something that would define the true meaning of strength. And in that moment, I was no longer the person who had been hurt. I was the person who had the power to decide what came next. As I stood there, facing the same people who once made me feel invisible, I felt a strange sense of calm settle inside me, because this was the moment that everything I had gone through had been leading toward, not a moment of anger or destruction, but a moment of choice, a moment that would define who I truly was beyond the pain of my past. My mother looked at me with eyes filled with regret and uncertainty, while Samir stood quietly, his confidence completely gone, and in that silence I realized that this was the opportunity one had once imagined during my darkest days, not in the exact way I had pictured it, but in a form that carried far more meaning than simple revenge. I could see clearly now that life had already given them a consequence for their actions. Their pride had collapsed, their certainty had turned into doubt, and the power they once held over me no longer existed. And in that realization I felt something unexpected, not satisfaction in their suffering, but clarity about my own strength. I took a slow breath and finally spoke, telling them that I would help. In the moment those words left my mouth, both of them looked at me in disbelief, because they had expected rejection or perhaps even anger, but not calm acceptance. Samir frowned slightly as if he could not understand why I would choose to stand by them after everything that had happened, and my mother stepped closer, her voice trembling as she asked me why I would do this after the way they had treated me, and I paused for a moment before answering because I wanted my words to reflect not just my thoughts but the journey that had shaped me. I told them that I was not helping them because they deserved it in the way they once defined worth, but because I refused to become the kind of person who measures humanity through past mistakes. I told them that I had spent years building my life from nothing, and in that process I had learned that true success is not just about rising above others but about rising above the version of yourself that is driven by bitterness and resentment. They listened silently, absorbing every word, and for the first time I felt like they were truly hearing me, not as the quiet son or the overlooked brother, but as someone who had something meaningful to say. However, my decision to help them did not mean that I would ignore reality or allow the same patterns to repeat. I explained that if I was going to be involved, things would be done differently. This time there would be structure, accountability, and clear boundaries. I would take control of the financial situation. I would assess the damage and create a plan to rebuild what could be saved, but this would not be a gift without responsibility. It would be a partnership shaped by the lessons I had learned through hardship. My mother nodded slowly, her pride replaced by a willingness to accept guidance, and Samir hesitated for a moment before agreeing because he understood that he no longer had the position to refuse. I began by reviewing their financial condition, going through documents, understanding the debts, and identifying the mistakes that had led them to this point. And as I worked through the details, I could see clearly how poor decisions and unchecked confidence had caused everything to fall apart. Loans taken without proper planning, investments made without research, trust placed in people who did not deserve it. All of it painted a picture of how fragile success can be when it is not supported by discipline and awareness. I created a structured plan to address their situation, starting with negotiating their debts, reducing unnecessary expenses, and stabilizing their remaining resources. It was not easy, and there were moments when progress felt slow, but I remained consistent because I knew that rebuilding anything requires patience and effort. I used my own resources carefully, not to simply erase their problems, but to create a foundation they could stand on, and as part of this process I made a decision that would redefine everything. I asked them to transfer the remaining property and business rights under my control, not as an act of dominance, but as a necessary step to ensure stability and prevent further mistakes. There was hesitation in their eyes, but they eventually agreed because they understood that this was the only way forward, and in that moment the balance of power shifted completely, not through force, but through trust and necessity. I took over the management of the business, implementing systems and strategies that I had developed over the years. I introduced new approaches, improved operations, and slowly began to rebuild its reputation and performance. Samir, who once stood above me, now worked under my direction, and at first it was difficult for him. His ego struggled with the change, his pride resisted the idea of taking instructions from someone he had once dismissed, but over time reality shaped his perspective, and he began to understand the value of humility and discipline. He worked hard, learning from his mistakes and gradually becoming more responsible and focused. My mother also changed in ways I had never seen before. She became more supportive, more aware of her words and actions, and more appreciative of the effort required to maintain stability. The house that once felt empty and neglected slowly regained its sense of life. The walls were repaired, the atmosphere became lighter, and a sense of balance returned, not the same as before, but stronger in a different way, built on lessons rather than assumptions. One evening, as I sat reviewing some work, my mother approached me quietly, and for a moment she stood there without speaking, as if searching for the right words, before finally saying that she was wrong about me and that she regretted the way she had treated me. Her voice carried a sincerity that I had never heard before, and as I looked at her I realized that this was not just an apology, it was an acknowledgement of everything I had become. I did not respond immediately because I wanted to understand what I truly felt, and after a brief pause I simply nodded, not because I needed to hear those words, but because I had already moved beyond the need for validation. My journey had taught me that self-worth does not come from others, it comes from within, and in that moment I understood that my revenge had never been about making them suffer or proving them wrong through confrontation. It was about living a life that spoke for itself. It was about showing through actions that I was capable of more than they had ever believed. Without lowering myself to their past behavior, I had rebuilt not just their lives, but my relationship with them on my own terms, and that was something far more powerful than any form of revenge driven by anger. As time passed, our family dynamic changed in ways none of us could have predicted. There was more respect, more understanding, and a sense of balance that had never existed before. Samir treated me differently, no longer with superiority but with recognition of my abilities, and my mother showed a level of care and appreciation that felt genuine and consistent, and while the past could never be erased, it no longer defined our present because we had all grown in different ways shaped by the consequences of our actions and the choices we made moving forward. And as I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized that true strength is not measured by how you respond to success, but by how you respond to those who once doubted you when you finally have the power to choose. And in choosing compassion with boundaries instead of resentment, I found a sense of peace that no amount of revenge could have given me, because in the end they thought they had taken everything from me. They believed I had nothing left, but what they never understood was that my true wealth was never something they could see or take. It was built in silence through struggle, resilience, and growth, and that was something they could only recognize once it stood right in front of them, undeniable and unshakable. And that is how I turned betrayal into strength and loss into a life that proved them wrong without ever needing to say it out loud.